Hello, and welcome to Understanding Autism Spectrum Disorder, or ASD. This will be a set of 6 sessions hosted by the Sheffield Adult Autism and Neurodevelopmental Service to give people that have been recently diagnosed or those that have had a diagnosis when they were younger but haven't been given much information about autism to understand a lot more about your condition. And this is session 1, an introduction to the course and laying the foundations for what is ASD. And in today's session, we're going to start off with a welcome from myself. I'll give you a brief introduction to the course. We will talk about your experiences of getting a diagnosis. And then we'll carry on with understanding what is ASD. And then we'll finish off with a conclusion and discussing what is in the next session. So let's start with a welcome. So my name is Jonathan, and I am an assistant psychologist at the Sheffield Adult Autism and Neurodevelopmental Service. So thank you for joining us, and I really hope you find these sessions useful. So what is this recorded course going to be like? So there will be 6 sessions, and these will be approximately 1 hour per session, and that's if you pause along with us to do the exercises throughout the session. You will hopefully have access or have been sent a workbook to use alongside the recorded course. So this workbook includes information that will be on the slides, so you can read the information on the workbook whilst I'm presenting to you. But there's also going to be some exercises in the workbook for you to do alongside the course. So I'm going to point these out to you as we go along, and I really encourage you to pause at the time requested and really spend some time considering the questions and doing the exercises. And what is this course going to cover? So there are 6 sessions, and in today's session, the first one, we're going to be just having a very basic introduction to what is autism. In session number 2, we're going to be focusing on anxiety, as well as some coping strategies. Session number 3, we'll be looking at sensory sensitivities and any issues people on the autistic spectrum have regarding their senses and how to manage them. Session number 4, we'll be focusing on social interaction and communication. Session number 5, we'll be looking at education and employment. And then the final session, session number 6, we'll be looking at the strengths of being autistic. So ending on a real positive. So to get the most out of the sessions, we really recommend that you watch all 6 and use your workbook to really engage with the information that I'm going to be presenting to you. So let's get started. What I'd like to do is talk you through a few quotes that we've had from previous people that have been through our service around receiving their diagnosis of autism. And whilst I read through these, I'd really like you to think about your own experiences, the thoughts that you had, and the emotions that you may have had when you got your diagnosis. Suddenly, everything made sense. I realised why I find some things difficult when they seem to come so naturally to everyone else. I have found that my diagnosis has allowed me to really focus on my goals. It is not a disability, it's a different way of looking at the world, and one that is equally valid. The diagnosis has allowed me to get the support I needed and helps me prove to people that it's not just a matter of trying harder. And when coming to terms with a diagnosis of autism, you might have gone through quite a lot of different emotions. First of all, you might have felt relieved, and you might have thought things make a lot more sense now. Some people might have felt fear, worried about how their future will look, what their life is going to be like in 5, 10 years. It's quite common to have a sense of denial, so feeling like you actually don't have autism and perhaps the practitioner got it wrong. And some people are really, really happy. They love being autistic and are really happy to have finally got to a place where they can understand themselves and become part of a community. Some people might feel quite ashamed, thinking back on things that had happened to them, or maybe things that they did when they were younger. And some people might feel quite frustrated or even anger, wondering, why me? Why am I autistic when maybe my friends aren't, and not many people in my family, if anyone, has also got this diagnosis? You might be feeling quite sad that you'll be this way forever, and maybe you don't want to be autistic. And what's also quite common, especially as this is an adult diagnostic service, is regret. So really wishing that you'd been identified before and wondering why it hadn't been picked up until this point in your life. So there are some positive emotions and some negative emotions that you might have felt since coming to terms with your diagnosis. And these emotions can definitely be like a roller coaster. I'm sure you've gone through a whole host of different emotions as the diagnosis has sunk in and time has gone on. And just know that that is completely normal and completely valid. And everyone is completely different. So hopefully things will start to improve for you now that you will learn a lot more around what your autism is like. But not only do you have to come to terms with your own diagnosis, sometimes the people around you might react in different ways to you finding out that you're autistic. In a positive way, other people might have been more supportive, so friends, family, or professionals hopefully have asked, how can we support you? Other people might be really accepting of it, so might have said to you, you know what, that makes a lot of sense, and might understand you a bit better. And just as you may be in denial about having a diagnosis, so might the other people that are in your life. So people might say, oh, don't be silly, you don't have autism, you can read, you can talk, you can make eye contact. But just remember that every autistic person is different. Other people might feel some shame or maybe some guilt. They might ask themselves why they didn't notice before. And some people might just not believe you. They might say you don't look autistic, you don't sound autistic, you don't act autistic. And again, every autistic person is so different from each other. And it might be that their understanding of what an autistic person looks like and acts like is very different to the reality. And sometimes people might be a bit dismissive of you. So they might say things like, well, everyone's a bit autistic, aren't they? So let's think about some negatives, but also some really good positives about getting a diagnosis. So some people have felt negative about their diagnosis because they say it's incurable. Perhaps other people's reactions to their diagnosis has been quite negative, and that's caused them to feel quite upset or angry. There's still a bit of a stigma and a lack of understanding about what autism is. And you might start to feel quite patronised by other people once they found out that you have a diagnosis of autism. And finally, there might also be a lack of support from other people around you, be that friends, family, professionals, or even work colleagues or other students. But there are a lot of positives with the diagnoses. So first of all is an understanding. So really understanding yourself, your difficulties and your strengths. And hopefully things have started to make a bit more sense. You might have gained access to support, whether that's through specific services, whether that's through your employment or education. And you might feel an acceptance of yourself. You might feel less alone. You might feel like you're not the only one. And now that you're autistic, there will be a whole community of other people that share a similar diagnosis to you that you can meet. And you might feel a sense of vindication. And hopefully you'll start to really appreciate your own unique strengths and the strengths that do come with being autistic. So now it's time for our first exercise. So if you have your workbook, I'd like you to go to page number 6. And I'd like you to spend the next 5, 10, maybe 15 minutes really thinking about how you reacted to your diagnosis, how other people reacted to finding out that you've got autism, as well as your own individual positive and negative thoughts around receiving a diagnosis. So if you pause the video here to complete the exercise, and then once you're done, let's pray. Okay, I hope you found that exercise useful. So let's begin the second part of the presentation. So what actually is autism? So autism is defined as a neurodevelopmental condition. So essentially that means that you have differences in the brain from birth. So essentially you are born this way. And autism is also a spectrum condition. So that means that whilst people on the autistic spectrum may share certain symptoms, traits and difficulties, the condition does affect everyone in loads of different ways. But there's still quite a lot of research to be done about what causes autism. And hopefully as time goes on, we'll gain a lot more of an understanding of this. In regards to terminology, there's quite a few different ways that you can talk about your autism. So first of all is autism. The one that we currently use at the Sheffield Adult Autism and Neurodevelopmental Service is ASD, which stands for Autism Spectrum Disorder, or saying I have ASD. And another one is Autism Spectrum Condition, so ASC. And that has evolved because sometimes there are some negative connotations with calling something a disorder, and quite a lot of autistic people do not feel that they have a disorder and would prefer it to be called a condition. There's also high functioning autism, and this was previously called Asperger's. And currently services in the UK no longer give a diagnosis of Asperger's. However, if you have been told that you've got Asperger's potentially from a diagnosis as a child, then that is still your identity. And if you want to identify as having Asperger's, then that is completely fine. The two most common terms are autism and Asperger's. And then another one is neurodiverse. So neuro means brain and diverse means, different. So often people in the autistic community will refer to themselves as neurodiverse, and people that do not have autism or any other neurodevelopmental condition is known as neurotypical. But just a note on terminology. So the terminology that you use is completely up to you. You may find that people with ASD use these terms interchangeably, or maybe even have their own terms, such as ASB or autistic. It is very individual, and if you do get a diagnosis of autism, which you will have done, you can refer to it in whatever way you feel comfortable. And this is the neurodevelopmental constellation. So if you look closely at the screen, in the middle is autism, or ASD. And this constellation is meant to show that there are quite a lot of different conditions or disorders that are really, really similar to autism, and they may overlap. But there's also a really high comorbidity between ASD and these particular conditions, which basically means that you might be more likely to have another one of these conditions alongside us having autism. So some of the more well-known neurodevelopmental conditions include ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, Tourette's, and epilepsy. And some that are slightly lesser known include dyscalculia, dysgraphia, and dysexecutive disorder. And all of these different conditions do have particular symptoms that are very similar to autism, but there's also a chance that you might have one or two of these other conditions. And if you would like to learn more about in any of these conditions, I would recommend searching them on the NHS website. So now we are going to do a bit of a true or false around autism, and I'd like you to play along. So number one, autism is a mental illness. Do you think this is true or false? This is false. So it is true that autism might cause you to have some mental health difficulties, such as low mood, depression, and anxiety, but autism itself is not a mental illness. You can grow out of autism. That's also false. So as we've mentioned previously, autism is a neurodevelopmental condition, which means you are born with autism and you will always be autistic because that's just the way that your brain is. However, as you do get older, you might find things become easier because you have experienced more things, but you might also learn some coping strategies to help you with any difficulties you have because of being autistic. So whilst you can't actually grow out or ever stop being autistic, you can definitely put things in place to make your life easier. Number 3, you can catch autism from others. That is also false. So autism is not contagious and you can't catch it from other people or give it to other people. You can't cure autism. Is that true or false? That is true. And as I've mentioned earlier, you cannot stop being autistic as it is the way that your brain and your genetic makeup is. Autism is caused by bad parenting. That is also false. So ASD is not caused by bad parenting, but some people with autism do report having difficult childhoods for various reasons, just as there might be in the neurotypical population. But there are also plenty of people with ASD who report having really happy and supportive upbringings. There is a thing such as autism-friendly parenting, which including being accepted and understanding their child's differences. And that can really help people with autism learn to manage their challenges and differences. But someone with autism will have autism regardless of how they have been raised. Vaccinations do not cause autism. True or false? So that one is true. So let's go into a bit of background around this one. So in 1998, there was research completed by a man called Andrew Wakefield, who claimed that there was a link between the MMR vaccine and the development of autism. But upon further investigation, it was found that the researcher had actually got conflicting interests, and this led to the credibility of his report being questioned. And since the report has been completely discredited, and Dr. Wakefield has also been struck off as being a doctor in the UK. And since that study and that report, multiple studies have since provided strong evidence that the MMR vaccine does not cause autism. So the next one, autism is a disability. That is true. So autism is considered a disability under the Equality Act of 2010, and therefore for legal purposes, it is a disability. However, people with autism have very different views on this. Some feel that their autism is definitely a disability, as it's made their life a lot harder, whereas other people prefer to consider it as more of a difference in the brain and maybe see it more as a condition. And your view on this is completely individual and completely up to you. Although from a legal perspective, having autism as a disability gives you quite a lot of protection if you feel discriminated against due to having ASD, or maybe if you feel that you need additional support to adjust to your different needs relating to ASD in both employment and education, for example. And we'll talk about that later on in the sessions. And then the final one, autism is another term for learning disability. True or false? So that one is false. So autism is not a learning disability. However, it can have an impact on learning. But this may be in the way that you learn rather than your ability to learn. And many people with autism have no issues with learning, and in fact, some might have really high levels of ability to learn, especially in topics that are particularly interesting to them. It is possible to have both autism and a learning disability. However, these are very separate diagnoses. So learning difficulties, such as dyslexia, is not the same as having a learning disability, as there is no indication of a lower IQ. And that is the true or false game over. I hope that might have cleared up any misconceptions you may have had about autism. So let's move on to the different areas of autism. So this is called the PENTAD of ASD. And this really helps clinicians understand the different difficulties that people have. And in order to get a diagnosis of autism, you need to be having difficulties in each of these 5 areas. So let's go through these areas. So some people without autism also have some difficulties in these areas for a variety of reasons, such as mental health difficulties, maybe communication disorders, sensory processing issues, or just general personal preference or personality traits. However, to get a diagnosis, as I've said, there have to be differences and difficulties in these areas. And these differences will have had to have been there since childhood, although they may have been experienced very differently or to a different extent to how they are experienced as an adult. So everyone who has an ASD diagnosis will have their own individual experience, and how these areas affect them will be really different for each person. So for example, some people might only have a mild sensory sensitivity to their 5 senses, whereas other people will have really significant sensory sensitivities to the extent that they might find it really difficult to tolerate noise, touch, or light, for example. Some people function very well with day-to-day tasks and only have occasional difficulty, whereas some people have quite significant difficulties to the extent that they may struggle to live independently and do tasks that they need to do. So we're going to go through each area in this model in more detail in the following slides. So this is just an overview. And as the course progresses, we will look at ways to manage each of the difficulties associated with each area, and essentially find ways to build on strengths associated with these areas. So let's start with social interaction and relationships. So being on the autistic spectrum means you might find it really difficult to make friendships or even maintain friendships. You might find it hard sharing enjoyment with other people. You might really struggle in unstructured social activities, so potentially spending time with other people just hanging out rather than doing a specific activity. There's also difficulties in understanding social rules, As a neurotypical society, there's quite a lot of unspoken social rules that aren't particularly obvious. Also, coping in groups can be really difficult, especially if you hadn't met anyone in that group. And there's quite a lot of different difficulties in groups regarding things like sensory sensitivity, in regards to sounds, as well as communication difficulties. The next area is social communication. So difficulties in this area include struggling with processing and the retaining of verbal information. You might struggle with certain conversational skills, such as doing small talk with strangers, knowing when to talk, potentially interrupting other people or getting interrupted yourself quite a lot. You might find that you've got difficulty in understanding irony, sarcasm, and jokes, not really understanding when people are being serious or not. There could be difficulty in understanding non-verbal expressions. So that could be facial expressions, gestures, and eye contact, and therefore using non-verbal expressions yourself might be quite reduced. So for example, not enjoying giving eye contact, so therefore you don't often give eye contact to the people around you. But sometimes using these expressions in an exaggerated way. And then just in terms of preferences for communication, you might find that you prefer speaking to people face to face. You might prefer doing it over the phone, or you might have made friends on the internet and prefer using text or chat boxes. Another area is called flexibility of thought. So this includes restricted and repetitive behaviours, absorbing and having quite narrow interests perhaps. So this might be a difference between passions and obsessions, and that very much depends on how much time you spend to that activity, whether you pursue that activity at the expense of other things, such as remembering to eat or go to the toilet. And you might find that when you are doing certain activities, you might become really upset or frustrated if you've been interrupted, or if people are trying to get your attention whilst you focus, you cannot comprehend what's going on and you have completely focused on what you are doing. And another quite common one is having collections, so liking to collect something, whether that's one particular thing or a whole variety of things. And another really common thing in this area is having a set approach to everyday life, such as having particular routines or maybe rituals that you have to do every day. So time for another exercise. So if you turn to page 9 in your workbook, I'd like you to spend 5 or 10 minutes really thinking about your own interests. So answer the questions and then pause the video and then resume once you're finished. So continuing with flexibility of thought, you might find that you need familiarity and sameness. You enjoy things being predictable, maybe even structured. And all of this is to essentially help you feel safe, as change is often quite upsetting and anxiety provoking. And there's also black and white thinking. So this could be thinking that something is 100% right or wrong, and really struggling to see the grey areas. And this is really, really common in autistic brains. So what about sensory sensitivities? So you might find that you're either over or undersensitive, or maybe both, to certain noises, the feel of certain things, taste, but as well as things like gravity, visual scenes, and lighting. So if you are hyposensitive, which means you're more undersensitive to things, you might find that you do a lot of sensory seeking behaviors. So this could be things such as really enjoying heavy pressure. So enjoying using a weighted blanket, you might have a heavy duvet, or you might carry around a heavy backpack. Might also be things like a lot of fidgeting, so spinning around, rocking, body movements, or snapping. You might also have difficulty in filtering out certain sensory sensitivities. So difficulty in screening out certain stimuli, which can lead to attention and concentration problems. So for example, if you are trying to concentrate, for example, on this presentation, but maybe there's a really loud sound coming from outside, you might notice that you really struggle filtering out those difficult sounds, and therefore you're finding it quite hard to concentrate on me. You might have a delayed processing of inputs, so where you don't actually register certain sounds, for example, until a bit later. But there's also some lesser known sensors. So proprioception is where is your body in space. So if you struggle with that, you might notice that you bump into things or hit things quite regularly. And then interoception, which is more around what's happening inside your body. So you might notice that you don't really feel hunger pains. You don't know if you're feeling sick sometimes or if you need to go to the toilet. And you might have very different pain thresholds. So for example, you might be very sensitive to pain, and even really small things, small touches might be really, really painful. Or different sensations could be painful, such as the shower. But you also might have a very high pain threshold, and therefore you can withstand things that hurt neurotypical people a lot more. And we're going to talk about sensory sensitivities in a lot more detail in the third session. Another difficulty is emotion regulation. So this means you might find it quite hard to understand and label your own emotions. You might be generally quite flat, or you might have sudden eruptions of stress, agitation, excitement, or anger. And you might find that you are very quick to calm, or sometimes it might be really, really slow, and you might take days to recover from particular eruptions of stress. And as I mentioned earlier, anxiety is really, really common. So there might be certain triggers for anxiety in an autistic person, and this could be social interaction. So potentially being the center of attention, feeling a lot of pressure to speak or interact with other people, especially new people. Any changes or being out of routine might be quite anxiety provoking. But this is really individual. So it might be useful for you to spend some time thinking about what your particular triggers are for anxiety. And that'll help you prepare for the second session next, which will be on anxiety and its management. And we're also going to spend some time today quickly talking about executive functioning. So this is a term for a range of different cognitive, emotional and behavioural difficulties. So executive functioning helps people plan and organise. It allows flexible thinking, which, as we've just found out, autistic people tend to have more inflexible thinking. Monitoring performance, multitasking, solving problems, being self-aware and learning rules. And then executive functioning also helps understand social behaviour, helps make decisions, give motivation, initiate appropriate behaviour and inhibit inappropriate behaviour, as well as controlling emotions and concentrating or taking in information. And often in autistic people, executive functioning is something that's really difficult. So you might find that looking through these examples that you can't perform these certain tasks. So to help with executive functioning, as it is so common, here is just a list of some coping strategies that you could put in place to help support you. So firstly, taking step-by-step approaches to work and potentially relying on visual organisational aids, especially if you struggle more with verbal instructions and information. And you can use tools like time organisers, calendars, computers, or maybe watches with alarms to help you with that. And if you are a very visual person, maybe making visual schedules or having calendars on your wall and checking them several times a day. Asking for written directions with any oral instructions whenever possible. Make sure that you plan and structure transition times and shifts in activities. Try your best to manage time efficiently by using things like clocks or alarms. Create checklists or to-do lists and potentially estimate how long each task may take. There's also certain computer software that can help with time management, such as the Franklin Day Planner, Palm Pilot, or Lotus Organizer. Making sure that your workspace is organized and there's minimal clutter. Or even consider having separate work areas with complete sets of supplies for different activities. And then potentially schedule in a weekly time to clean and organize your workspace. So hopefully some of those strategies might help with any executive dysfunction that you may be having. So as we're coming towards the end of today's session, the introduction to autism, Here are some general things that could help. And as we go through each session, we'll give more specific things that you can do to make things easier for you and any difficulties you may have. So making sure that your life or your day is structured and as predictable as possible, and this will help minimize anxiety. Making sure that you feel familiar and therefore feel safe. So if you're going somewhere new, trying your best to find out as much about that particular place as you can means that once you arrive, you'll have a bit more familiarity to it. Doing sensory activities. So there are things that you can do to help calm yourself and soothe your senses. And we'll talk about that in week number 3. Making sure that you have access to different forms of clear communication. So be that verbal or written down. Having favoured activities that you can do on a regular basis, as well as favoured topics of conversations. So hopefully finding people in your life that you can share certain activities and interests with. And the final exercise I'd like you to think about today is called a life in balance. So this is essentially how to cope in a neurotypically biased world. So on the left are different things that you might have in your life or things you like doing, which might be really stressful. And on the right are certain coping or thriving strategies that you could put in place to deal with the neurotypical world. So on the left, things that might be worth the stress include having friendships and relationships, sharing your interests with other people, feeling responsible and independent, going on holiday, accessing public transport, and going to social events. So what things could you put in place to cope with these? So having a structure and routine, so planning out exactly what's going to be happening with your week. Maybe having access to a low stimulation environment, so be that at home, at work, or in education. Having somewhere you can go to really unwind, where there's low light levels or relaxing lights. Maybe some nice smells, some calming music or sounds. But also doing activities to help soothe any of your sensitivities. So using particular sensory objects, maybe taking time to go for a walk out in nature, maybe having a bath. And also engaging in your favourite activities, be that reading, watching TV, playing on a games console. So please take the time to open up your workbook to page 12 and really think about your own life. And in the blank space on the left-hand side, write what things in your life that you really like to do, even if they're stressful. And then on the right-hand side, think about your own coping and thriving strategies that you've done up until this point to help you deal with those more stressful situations. So pause the video now and spend 5 to 10 minutes on this exercise. So just to conclude, in regards to a life in balance, Just really think about what activities, relationships and events in your life may be worth the stress, and consider what strategies you can use to thrive or cope in these situations. And just remember to consider what helps you individually. And come back to this throughout the course, especially as you learn more techniques to help manage any difficulties that you may have been facing. And try to keep your strategies positive. And all of the difficulties that we have described today could also be considered strengths. And this is going to be continued in the 6th session. So really consider how these 5 different areas affect you in both good and bad ways. And think about what you're doing at the moment that you find helpful. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this first session and that you've learned some new things. And I will see you over at session number 2, where we'll be talking about managing your anxiety. Take care. Bye-bye.